On the screen, a girl clung tightly to a man. Watching from behind his monitor, Yoshio called out to the characters as though they could hear him, urging two of them to get along and telling another not to just stand there, but to do something. He settled himself in and hoped for another good day with his villagers. This is a story about a man who spent a decade as a jobless failure, and who eventually became the god of fate who saved a group of villagers. But it is also the story of how those same villagers saved him in return. 1 month before any of that happened, Yoshio was trying to eat lunch when his mother came to him with the same question she always asked, whether he had found a job yet. She reminded him that his father was not going to be able to keep working forever, and pressed him to think about what would happen to him if something went wrong with either of his parents. Yoshio sat frozen for a moment before losing his patience and telling her to give him a break. His mother fired back immediately, asking in frustration when he was ever actually going to do something about his situation. Yoshio thought to himself that it never stopped, that he could not even enjoy a quiet lunch in peace. His appetite disappeared entirely. He slammed his hand on the table and stormed out of the room, fully aware as he did it that he was behaving badly, but unable to stop himself. His mother called after him to at least finish eating, but he was already gone. As he sat in his room, he thought back over how things had gotten to this point. After finishing high school, he had gone to college, not a prestigious one, but a decent enough school, and had managed to graduate. Up to that point, things had been moving along acceptably, but it had not lasted. Like everyone else, he had started looking for work before graduation. Company after company turned him down. His motivation steadily drained away until there was nothing left of it. One afternoon, while sitting on his bed, his phone buzzed with a message. A friend had written to say he had received a job offer. Yoshio sat with his emotions churning as he typed out a response. Then another message came, the same friend asking how things were going for Yoshio. Yoshio switched the phone off immediately, the bitterness too much to sit with. He had graduated without a job. A year passed, then another. Before he had fully processed what was happening, an entire decade had gone by. His mother had remarked at some point that he was past 30 now and had brought up someone from down the street who had a good job and had already given his parents a grandchild. Yoshio did not need the reminder. He was well aware that many of his old classmates now had homes and lives of their own. And then there was him. The doorbell rang. He turned to look. A delivery man appeared on the door camera and announced that he had a delivery. Yoshio told him to wait and that he would be right there. His mother's voice arrived almost immediately, noting with mild surprise that it had been a while since Yoshio had answered the door and wondering aloud whether he had ordered something and how he was affording it. Yoshio told her to back off. She speculated that he had probably won something from one of his online contests again. Yoshio moved toward the door, thinking to himself. The guilt of not having a job gnawed at him constantly, and entering online giveaway contests was his way of managing that guilt. Sometimes it actually worked out. Other times the prizes were things he would have rather kept away from his parents' eyes, which made it important for him to always get to the door before anyone else could. He opened the door and signed for the package, privately reflecting that the act of making eye contact with the delivery man had probably made the man uncomfortable. It was not such an unreasonable reaction, he thought. A disheveled-looking man at home, in the middle of a workday. He had long since gotten used to that kind of look from people around the neighborhood. He did not even try to disguise it anymore. The package was quite small. His mother reappeared just as he received it and observed that it did not look like a food delivery, which made Yoshio flinch. She wandered off after a moment. He took the box back to his room and opened it. Inside was what appeared to be a PC game called The Village of Fate. He assumed it was probably some kind of pre-release test version and turned his attention to the letter tucked inside. The letter greeted him by name and congratulated him on being selected as an alpha tester for the game. It described the game as using the latest in artificial intelligence technology and claimed it was the world's first game to feature NPCs that truly thought and behaved exactly like real human beings. Yoshio muttered that the description was overselling it considerably and kept reading. His role in the game would be that of the villagers' god, guiding their fate through divine prophecy. Once per day, he would be able to give his villagers guidance that they would use to grow and develop their village, with the finer details of gameplay to be discovered by actually playing. Yoshio found that explanation rather lacking and thought the whole setup sounded like a fairly standard village simulation so far. He continued reading. The letter asked that he keep everything about the game strictly confidential and refrain from sharing any information about it online. Breaking this condition would result in his access being revoked and the game being reclaimed. Yoshio thought the word promise was an odd choice for something that should have been a proper contract or legal agreement. He also wondered how anyone would be able to identify him specifically if he did post something, since he was presumably not the only person they had selected to test it. There were 2 more conditions listed. The first was that he must remain connected to the internet while playing. The second was more unusual. If all of his villagers died, the game would end permanently. It could not be started again, and because the game saved data automatically, there was no way to roll back to an earlier point. Yoshio found that surprisingly harsh, even for a testing scenario. He questioned what the purpose of having a tester was if the tester was not allowed to let everyone die. The whole thing felt suspicious. He debated with himself whether to install it at all. He reasoned that a quick web search could not get him into trouble, and since he had no way of knowing whether the disk contained malware, he decided to use his older secondary computer rather than his main one. The game probably was not technically demanding anyway, and there was a decent chance it was all just someone's elaborate prank. But on the other hand, what did he really have to lose beyond the time he would otherwise spend mindlessly scrolling through the internet? Even if it turned out to be a joke, it would at least give him something to talk about. He installed the game. The title appeared on the monitor in a clean and distinctive logo. He thought to himself that it looked good, though he could not decide whether the style was deliberately minimalist or just the result of not trying very hard. Without spending any more time debating it, he clicked to begin. He waited for the game to load, and when the screen finally came to life, his eyes went wide with surprise. He stared in genuine shock at what he was looking at. The game opened on a scene of a man driving a horse-drawn wagon, and the visual quality was staggering. Every detail of the horse and the wagon wheels was rendered with extraordinary realism. It was the finest graphics work he had ever seen in any game by a considerable distance. On screen, the man driving the wagon gritted his teeth and glanced back over his shoulder, finding that the enemies chasing him had not given up. The monsters came sprinting toward him at full speed. Sitting behind a screen, Yoshio observed the scene unfolding in front of him and noted to himself that it was the familiar medieval fantasy setting. The characters already had monsters on their tail right from the very start. Inside the wagon on screen, four people were crowded together. Three of them clung to one another in fear and trembling, while one of the women murmured a desperate and repeated plea directed at the god of fate. Outside the wagon, a monster lunged forward and swung its weapon, slicing through a section of the wagon before letting out a loud and menacing cry. Yoshio watched with growing tension and moved his mouse instinctively. One of the monsters on screen sprinted alongside the horse, pulling the wagon. Yoshio reacted out loud, warning the character that the monster was targeting the horse. On screen, the man drew his sword just as the monster was bringing its own weapon down and deflected the strike at the very last moment. The two continued exchanging blows as the wagon raced ahead without slowing. Then a second monster appeared beside the man. He clenched his teeth as the new threat raised its weapon and aimed directly at him. But at that very moment, a book that one of the women inside the wagon was holding suddenly lit up with a powerful glow. The light burst outward from inside the wagon, forcing the monster to squeeze its eyes shut against the brightness before it was slowly swallowed up entirely by the radiance. Yoshio gasped in complete shock, staring at the screen and demanding to know what had just happened. On screen, the man glanced back at the monsters that had now fled and turned to share the relieving news with the others inside the wagon. Yoshio exhaled slowly and wondered if everyone was all right. He figured the opening cutscene had come to an end and tried to work out what he was supposed to do next. The group climbed out of the wagon one by one. Yoshio clicked on the man, and with a brief notification, sound a character information window appeared on his screen. He read through it with mild interest. The man's name was Gams, 26 years old, a swordsman whose face and body were marked with numerous scars, and the older brother of a priestess named Chemistry. Yoshio glanced over at the religious-looking girl in the group and clicked on her next. Her profile confirmed she was Chem, 19 years old, a priestess of the god of fate and Gam's younger sister. Yoshio noted that the two of them did not look particularly alike. He wondered briefly if a Japanese studio had developed the game, given the extraordinary level of quality on display, and thought that if that were the case, it would surely have been widely known and talked about already. The whole thing was puzzling, but he pushed the thought aside and decided to look at the remaining characters. The second man was named Raw Dice, 33 years old, married with one child, and had previously operated a general store in whatever village the group had come from. The little girl was Carol, 7 years old, described as a lively and energetic child who showed a surprising level of maturity for her age. The woman was named Lyra, 30 years old, described as serious and dedicated, and though she was younger than her husband Radice, she had a quiet but firm way of keeping him in line. Yoshio concluded that the three of them were a family, and that all five characters together were probably the main cast of the game. Entertaining as it was to simply sit back and watch everything play out, he reminded himself that he needed to figure out how the game actually worked. He looked back at the information he had been given, recalling something from the letter about divine prophecy. The speakers gave a short buzz as on-screen dialogue appeared. Yoshio observed that the conversations were text only, without voice acting, and figured that full voice work would have been quite the undertaking. Gams was expressing guilt to the group, apologizing for only being able to get the five of them out when he had been responsible for protecting the whole village. Radice immediately pushed back and told him there was absolutely no need to apologize, pointing out the sheer number of monsters that had been involved and insisting that getting any of them out alive at all was a miracle. Carol jumped in with an excited question about the strange burst of light she had seen, directing it at Gams and using a casual nickname for him. Kim immediately cut in with a stern correction, reminding Carol that Gams was her brother and that she had told her many times not to call him by that name. Yoshio watched all of this quietly from behind his screen and thought to himself that the priestess had a noticeably intense attachment to her brother. He also concluded that a handsome swordsman paired with a younger sister who was perhaps a little too devoted to him made for a clear main character setup. Gams gently told Kim to be patient with Carol since she was only a child. Kim apologized to him right away. Carol found the whole exchange funny and pointed out that Kim had been the one getting corrected. Yoshio noted privately that the characters all felt genuinely well-rounded and that the game was showing real promise. Lyra stepped in and redirected everyone, suggesting they set aside the light-hearted bickering and focus on understanding what the mysterious light had been. Kim agreed, and, clearly finding it difficult to believe herself, told the group that the light had come directly from her book of scripture. At that moment, a short sound played from the speakers and a notification window appeared on Yoshio's screen. It informed him that as the villagers' god, his purpose was to guide them toward prosperity. He could not control the villagers directly, but once each day, he could fill a page of Kim's book of scripture with a new divine prophecy. The prompt invited him to write his very first prophecy and told him he could write absolutely anything he chose. Yoshio was genuinely surprised. He had assumed there would be a simple selection menu to work from, but the game was expecting him to actually type something out in his own words. He decided not to overthink it, reasoning that the system would probably only be able to process basic words, or perhaps a short sentence at most. He spent some time composing his message carefully, making sure it carried enough weight and grandeur to sound like something a god might actually say. When he was finally satisfied, he typed it out and entered it. He thought to himself that if the artificial intelligence could understand even a small portion of what he had written, this game was an easy candidate for the best he had ever played. The moment he hit enter, the book in Kim's hands on screen glowed brilliantly. Her eyes went wide, and she dropped to her knees. She cried out that it was a genuine miracle and offered her thanks to the god of fate, then called out to the others to gather around, telling them that the god of fate had made his will known through her book. The group crowded around to read what had appeared. Rodice was overcome with emotion, declaring it a true miracle. Lyra admitted with some awkwardness that neither she nor Carol could read. Carol confirmed she could not make out a single word of it. Gam said he could read a little, but admitted that the writing of a god was probably beyond what he could manage, and asked him to read it aloud on behalf of everyone. Lyra and Carol waited for her to begin. Kim composed herself and read the prophecy carefully to the group. It addressed them as beloved survivors, introduced itself as the god of fate, expressed pleasure that they had escaped the pursuing monsters through the miracle, and promised to deliver one prophecy each day from that point on. It instructed them to follow the commandments and promised that prosperity would follow. It concluded by directing them to gather timber and build themselves a shelter. On his side of the screen, Yoshio sat in a state of complete disbelief. He could barely process what he was witnessing. Lyra broke down in tearful gratitude, overwhelmed that the god of fate had shown such care for them. Rodice added his heartfelt thanks for both the rescue and the daily guidance that had been promised. Carol sat quietly with a gentle smile and prayed without words. Yoshio, still unable to fully accept what he was seeing, asked himself aloud whether the game had genuinely understood everything he had written, including all the elaborate and old-fashioned phrasing he had put into it. He thought that the artificial intelligence running the game might be decades more advanced than anything currently known to exist. If the characters could genuinely comprehend and respond to whatever he chose to write, then the game was something truly extraordinary. Yoshio was amazed, but quickly caught himself and raised a reasonable doubt. For all he knew, his prophecy had simply happened to match a behavior pattern that was already programmed into the game. He wondered what was really going on beneath the surface. Inside the screen, Kim gathered the group and suggested they divide up the work and begin chopping down trees in response to the god's instruction to gather wood and build a shelter. After a short while, Rodice raised a practical concern. While there were certainly plenty of trees in the forest, freshly cut wood could not be used as building material right away. The logs would need to be cut into planks, and that could not be done with fresh timber. The wood needed time to dry out properly first, otherwise anything built with it could warp or develop serious structural problems over time. Kim was genuinely surprised to hear this, not having known that trees needed to dry before they could be used for building. Yoshio reacted with equal surprise from behind his screen. He was used to games where collecting wood meant being able to build with it immediately. He had never had to think about the actual properties of fresh timber before. He thought quietly to himself that he and Kim were apparently both learning something new. Rodice pressed on regardless, pointing out that a god's intentions were beyond ordinary human understanding, and that the command was still worth following. He suggested they at least start gathering wood in preparation, since they would need it eventually whether or not they could use it right away. Yoshio was grateful for Rodice's practical thinking, which had smoothly rescued the situation from an awkward halt. The two men went off to start chopping wood, while the women moved to explore the surrounding area and look for food. Yoshio watched and narrated events to himself as they unfolded. He noticed that by scrolling the mouse, he could zoom the view outward considerably, which he immediately tried. He gasped when he saw how the map looked from a distance. The thin, visible strip stretching through the landscape appeared to be the path the group had taken during their escape in the wagon. He recognized it as a fog of war system. More of the map would become visible as the characters physically explored more of the area. He was skeptical, though, that the only way to interact with the game was through a single prophecy per day. That seemed far too limiting to be the whole picture. Just then, another information window appeared on his screen. He read through the new tutorial it contained. The god of fate, it explained, had one more way to interact with the villagers. By spending something called fate points, a wide range of miracles could be performed. Yoshio wondered what fate points were, and the window conveniently explained that as the villagers praised their god more deeply, faith would grow and fate points would accumulate. The window directed his attention to a number displayed in the upper right corner of the screen, which showed he currently had 100 points. The total, the window explained, would grow in relation to his villagers' devotion, and having more villagers would naturally generate more points. Writing prophecies that genuinely benefited the villagers would increase their gratitude and earn him more points in return. Yoshio understood. The quality of his prophecies would directly affect how many points he could accumulate. The tutorial also encouraged him to grow the village and draw in more worshippers, noting that doing so would also improve the strength of the miracles available to him. He clicked on a miracles menu to see what options were available. The list included things like spawning a traveling merchant, a traveling physician, or traveling hunters, as well as the ability to reunite the group with any villagers who had escaped. Yoshio felt a spark of satisfaction at the realization that he could influence their lives and destinies in direct and meaningful ways. He also noticed he had some control over the weather, which he thought was a suitably godlike power to possess. However, he recognized that his current fate point total was not large enough to spend carelessly. He decided to listen in on the characters for a while to get a better sense of what the group needed before committing any points to a miracle. Rod Ice and Gams were working together chopping trees. Rod Ice remarked that they were fortunate to have the blessing and protection of the god of fate. Gams agreed briefly. Rod Ice noted that the weather was pleasant at least and hoped the rain would hold off. Gams agreed again with equal brevity. Rod Ice then attempted to continue the conversation by observing that Gams and Kim seemed to be very close. Gams gave another one-word agreement and nothing more. Yoshio watched this exchange with quiet frustration. He thought to himself that Gams was putting in almost no effort in the conversation, while Rod Ice was clearly trying his best to keep things going. The two men, he concluded, were not going to give him any useful information to work with. He decided to check in on the women instead and clicked over to them. Kim was asking Lyra about their food supply. Lyra told her they had managed to escape with 3 boxes of supplies from a shop and estimated that if they were careful about portions, the food might last them roughly 2 weeks. Kim replied with worry, expressing hope that they would be able to find a stable source of food before that time ran out. Yoshio took that in and immediately began thinking through options. A traveling merchant miracle might allow them to buy food, or perhaps there's something available in the natural environment around them, fishing, or foraging for things that could be eaten. He then shifted his attention to the map situation, thinking that someone needed to explore the surrounding area to clear the fog and reveal what was out there. His first instinct was to send Gams out to explore the next day. But then he reconsidered. Gams was the only person in the group who could fight, which meant sending him away from the others could leave them vulnerable. He reminded himself that this was a game and tried to think about it objectively. Carol was the least essential in terms of utility if winning was the goal. Sending her to explore seemed like the logical choice from a purely strategic standpoint. At that moment, Carol's excited voice came through the screen as she called out to her mother about a mushroom she had found. Lyra immediately and firmly told her to drop it, identifying it as poisonous. Carol made a disappointed sound. Yoshio reconsidered his previous thought immediately. Game or not, he would feel terrible if a bad decision on his part got any of them killed. He needed a different approach. He began looking through the miracle options again and landed on something that excited him. The ability to summon a familiar, the kind of creature a wizard might use as a companion. With an animal familiar under his control, he could fly it across the unexplored areas of the map and reveal the terrain without putting anyone in danger. He opened a familiar selection list and immediately found there were more than 50 options to choose from. The list included everything from unicorns to slimes, covering a remarkable range of creatures. He thought that a bird would be the ideal choice for aerial reconnaissance, allowing him to fly it over the entire map at once. However, his excitement deflated quickly when he looked at the costs. Everything on the list was far more expensive than his current fate point total could cover. Even the most ordinary options, a cat or a dog, were beyond what he could afford. With the points he currently had, the only thing within his reach was a baby chick. He figured that once it grew up, it could at least lay eggs and contribute to the food supply, but it was completely useless for exploring the map. Yoshio found himself wondering whether there was a faster way to earn fate points than simply waiting for the villagers to worship him more. As if the game had heard him, another notification window appeared on his screen. It told him there was indeed another way to increase his fate point total, a pay-for-point system. Yoshio stared at the screen in disbelief. The system explained that fate points could be purchased at a rate of 1,000 yen per 10 points. He was completely thrown off by this. He thought it was outrageous to include a cash shop in what was supposed to be an alpha test. With his current points, the only thing he could summon was a chick. But if he spent 20,000 yen, he could just about afford a cat or a small dog. Setting familiars aside entirely, more fate points in general would give him the ability to help the villagers in meaningful ways. He continued scrolling through his options and then got up and opened his cupboard, checking what he had. He found that he had just over 10,000 yen remaining. He thought through what else he could put together. He had books and games he no longer used that he could sell, as well as several giveaway prizes he had never even opened that could be put up for auction. He scratched his head and turned the question over in his mind, unsure of what to do. Later that night, Yoshio watched the screen with mild surprise as the villagers began settling into sleep. He noted to himself that it was only 9 in the evening. Carol said a cheerful good night to Gams. Kim added her own tender good night to her brother. Gams replied with a single short word. Rod Ice encouraged Gams to get some rest as well. But Gams refused, saying someone needed to stay awake and keep watch in case any monsters appeared. Rod Ice pushed back warmly, saying that after everything they had witnessed, the miraculous light, the prophecy from the god of fate, surely the god was watching over them and would not allow any monsters to come near. Gams replied quietly that he would like to believe that. Yoshio read the exchange and felt a pang of guilt. He apologized inwardly to Rod Ice, knowing full well that keeping monsters away was well beyond what he could actually do with his current resources. He grew anxious, realizing that at this rate the villagers were going to build up expectations that he was fully capable of protecting them no matter what happened. Part of him thought he should somehow let them know that he was not all-powerful for their own safety. But he also knew that if their faith in him began to waver, the praise would slow, the fate points would stop growing, and everyone would suffer for it. He pushed the thought aside and decided to look for something practically useful instead, advice on how to properly prepare and dry wood for construction. He began searching online. It occurred to him, as he did so, that it had been a very long time since he had genuinely looked something up for a real purpose. The better part of the last decade had been spent watching videos and occasionally leaving comments on message boards, time that was now gone and would never come back. He thought that if he had used those years even a little more wisely, he might have had something more useful to offer the villagers now. If he had held a job, he would have had savings he could draw on to buy fate points. The villagers were all hardworking, capable people. A player who had lived a more ordinary working life would probably know instinctively how to make things easier for them. Yoshio let out a long and heavy sigh, then quietly reminded himself that games were supposed to be enjoyable. He told himself to stop feeling sorry for himself. He glanced up and caught his reflection in the glass of the window, and in that same moment, a sharp throbbing pain hit him and he squeezed his eyes shut. He pressed his hand against his side where the pain was concentrated, letting out a small, strained breath. He muttered to himself that the cold must be getting to the old scar, making it act up again. Another regret to add to the already large pile. A memory surfaced without warning. He was young again, facing a man and shouting at him to stay away from his sister. The man stood in silence. Yoshio grabbed him by the collar and demanded that he make a promise, swear that he would leave her alone. The man said something. Yoshio called out. His sister's voice came from nearby, crying out his name in alarm. Before he could react, blood was dripping to the ground. The man had stabbed him with a knife. Yoshio broke into a cold sweat. He cried out in pain as the man pulled the knife free and he crumpled to the ground. The man loomed over him, pointing the knife downward with a twisted grin on his face. Yoshio screamed for him to stop, screamed for someone to help. His sister was in a panic somewhere nearby, and Yoshio desperately tried to drag himself away from the man. And then it happened. That was the moment he left something important behind and ran. From that point on, nothing had gone right for him, no matter how hard he had tried afterward. He pushed the memory away. That was the past. All he wanted now was to lose himself in the game. It was not as though there was anything else he could do. The next morning, sunlight came streaming through the window. Yoshio slowly opened his eyes and realized it was already morning. He had gotten deeply absorbed in researching lumber the night before and must have drifted off to sleep at some point during it. He muttered to himself about how long it had been since he had woken up this early, glancing at the clock as he came to. He looked at the screen and saw that all of the villagers had already been up and active for some time. He watched them for a moment and concluded that his suspicion had been correct. The villagers in this game lived and worked in real time, continuously, regardless of whether he was watching. He turned his attention to thinking about what kind of prophecy he should send them for the day. Before he could get very far with that thought, his stomach growled. He had been so caught up in the game the night before that he had completely forgotten to eat dinner. He had gone through all of his snacks without noticing. He got up and made his way downstairs to see what was in the fridge. As he approached the kitchen, he heard voices, someone asking for the soy sauce to be passed, another voice asking for it to be sent their way as well. Yoshio froze in place. He immediately stepped back and pressed himself out of sight, whispering to himself in alarm. It was breakfast time. He listened from a safe distance as his sister mentioned that she would probably be working late that evening. His mother expressed concern and told her not to overwork herself. His sister replied that she knew. Yoshio stood there thinking. Ever since the incident involving his sister Sayuki and the argument that had followed with his father about work, the family had barely exchanged more than a handful of words with one another. For a brief moment, he imagined himself walking into the kitchen, greeting them cheerfully and asking if he could join them for breakfast. He dismissed the image immediately. They were sitting down to eat before heading off to another full day of work. He could not show his face in there without a job to his name. The thought settled heavily over him, and he turned around and went back to his room. Once inside, he told himself he would exercise. He started with some warm-up movements, his thoughts drifting as he moved. Ever since the incident, he had been making an effort to stay physically fit. He had been weak once, and that weakness had made him run away. He was trying now to run away from that weakness itself, to not be that person anymore. He continued lifting weights in steady repetitions and glanced over at his computer screen, where the villagers were already going about their morning. He watched as Lyra expressed concern about whether someone could really carry everything she was holding. Carol replied with cheerful confidence that she was perfectly fine and wanted to help. Rod-Ice fussed over Carol, telling her to let him know right away if anything became too heavy for her. Carol smiled brightly and agreed. Yoshio was struck by the scene. He muttered to himself that he was not living half the kind of life these characters were, and they were not even real people. He refocused and decided that the villagers were starting to place too much faith in him as a god, expecting more than he was actually capable of delivering. He felt it was important to manage those expectations before they grew any further. He sat down and wrote a new prophecy for the day. After a moment, the book in Kim's hands glowed on screen. She called the group together immediately and read the prophecy aloud to them. It told them that in truth, the god of fate had lost most of his power, and that for the time being, all he was able to do was watch over them and perform modest miracles. It declared that his greatest commandment to his devoted followers was that they work together and support one another in order to survive, and it offered his blessings to them all. The villagers fell into silence after Kim finished reading. Yoshio looked at the screen in confusion, worried that his honesty had damaged their faith in him. He panicked inwardly, thinking they had figured out that their god was a fraud with nothing to offer, and scolded himself for not coming up with a better explanation. Then Kim spoke up with warmth and genuine feeling, telling the others how wonderful it was that the god of fate had said he was watching over them. Yoshio stared at the screen in surprise. Rod-Ice jumped in as well, marveling that the god had given them his blessings and expressing awe at what it meant. He even constructed an elaborate interpretation on his own, suggesting that the god must have lost his power during some great and holy battle against corrupted gods, and that just as the god of fate had fought for them, they too must now fight for themselves. The others took this in with equal feeling and determination. Yoshio watched all of this unfold with quiet disbelief and remarked to himself that they had given his words a remarkably generous reading. He then noticed that his fate point total had gone up. He realized with some interest that the prophecies did in fact have a direct effect on his points after all, regardless of the content, as long as the villagers received them with faith and gratitude. The increase in fate points from the last prophecy had not been very large. At the rate things were going, Yoshio estimated he might be able to manage one decent miracle per week at best. He thought to himself that was not going to make life meaningfully easier for the villagers. He thought back to something the women had been talking about earlier. Kim had expressed how much she was looking forward to sleeping in a proper room again, and having real walls between herself and the outside world. Even a simple fence around the cart would offer some comfort in the meantime. Lyra had agreed, but pointed out that building a fence was not possible without using the logs that were being saved for the house. She had also mentioned that while their food supply was holding, they were running low on spices, and that she would be very grateful for even a small amount of salt. Hearing their wishes and worries, Yoshio thought about how a few more fate points would allow him to address some of those concerns. But spending what little he had right now would be wasteful. If he truly wanted to help them more, he was going to have to buy more points. He thought about the unopened giveaway prizes he had stashed away and figured that putting them up for auction online could bring in somewhere between 20 and 30,000 yen. He looked around his room for anything else that might be sellable. Taking things to a secondhand shop was the fastest way to turn them into cash, but there was one problem with that plan. It meant going outside. He looked toward the window and tried to remember how long it had been. Not months, he realized. He had not been out in the sun in roughly 2 years. He glanced back at the monitor. If all the villagers died, the game would end and he would never be able to play it again. He could not let that happen. He made his decision and told himself to go. He got dressed and immediately noticed that his shirt felt tighter than he remembered, even though he had not gained any weight. He thought to himself that this was not how he had pictured his 30s looking when he was young. He had genuinely expected to feel like a proper adult by now. Then he stopped. He turned around and walked back to his computer. He told himself there was no need to rush. Maybe tomorrow would be a better day for going out. He sat back down and turned his attention to the screen. He noticed Carol walking alone, carrying some sticks. Without warning, her foot caught on a rock and she fell hard to the ground. Yoshio watched with genuine worry on his face. Carol sniffled and touched her wounded knee with a wince, then wiped her tears away quietly, picked up the stick she had dropped, and stood back up as though nothing had happened at all. She kept going without complaint. Yoshio watched the whole thing in silence and clicked something on the screen. Meanwhile, Rod-Ice and Gams were carrying dried logs, and Lyra and Kim were washing clothes together. A heavy sigh escaped someone on screen. Something shifted in Yoshio. He clenched his teeth and told himself firmly that today was a new day. If those villagers, people in far harder circumstances than his own, could push through and fight for themselves, then so could he. He got up from his chair immediately and walked out of his room. His mother spotted him in the hallway and asked with genuine surprise whether he was going somewhere, noting that it was quite rare to see him heading out and asking if something was wrong. Yoshio told her briefly that he was just stepping out for a bit. His mother told him to take care. He got on his bike and rode out. Some of the neighbors saw him and began whispering among themselves. Yoshio thought to himself as he pedaled that they were probably laughing at him, or perhaps thinking poorly of him for being a man his age without a job. The words and imagined judgments started crowding into his mind. Then, quite suddenly, the faces of the villagers appeared in his thoughts. Their warmth, their effort, their quiet determination. His eyes went wide. He pressed down hard on the pedals and rode off quickly, leaving the neighborhood behind him. He went to a shop and sold what he had brought with him. Afterward, he stopped by the library. He looked through the available books, muttering to himself that he doubted they would have anything specifically about building a village from scratch. He found a number of portal fantasy novels, the kind where an ordinary person gets pulled into a fantasy world and earns the admiration of those around him through the knowledge they carry from the modern world. His own situation with the game was somewhat similar, though different enough that those books might not be directly useful. Still, he figured it was worth looking through them for ideas. Even spending a few extra $100 on new books was beyond what he could justify at the moment. He got back on his bike and rode home, quietly saying goodbye to the money he had spent. Along the way, he spotted a familiar shop. He remembered his family used to go there together quite often when he was younger. He stopped his bike and went inside. The staff greeted him at the door. Nearby, two children were arguing cheerfully over something they both wanted. Yoshio moved quietly past them and ordered 4 puddings, wondering to himself as he did whether it was a pointless way to spend what little money he had left. The staff thanked him warmly and wished him well. He arrived home shortly afterward and announced that he was back, holding out the puddings he had brought. His mother was surprised and thanked him, asking if he had really bought them. He told her there was enough for everyone and went upstairs. Alone in his room, he caught himself feeling a small but embarrassing sense of satisfaction. He immediately questioned himself for it, thinking that one small kind gesture did not come close to making up for an entire decade of doing nothing. He told himself firmly not to get carried away and admitted quietly that it really was time to grow up. Yoshio settled back at his computer with a sense of quiet satisfaction, having successfully loaded up 20,000 yen worth of fate points. He opened the miracles menu and began thinking about which one to use. On screen, the villagers had gathered together while they waited for their food to finish cooking. Yoshio thought back to something he had discovered earlier, a log of all the villager conversations he had missed while he was away from the screen. It felt a little like reading someone's private diary, and he was not entirely comfortable with that. But it was also the most reliable way he had of finding out what the villagers genuinely needed from him. He decided to take a small look. He pulled up a conversation from earlier that day between the women, which had taken place while he was out. Lyra had been grateful for the good weather, and Kim had expressed hope that the monsters would keep their distance during such a calm stretch of days. Lyra noted that the fine weather would dry the laundry quickly, and Kim agreed, saying they were fortunate to have a river so close by. Kim had then brought up the matter of bathing, worrying about being caught out in the open without any cover, both by monsters and by the men in the group. Lyra responded with a casual and unbothered attitude, saying she had long since stopped caring about that sort of thing. Carol cheerfully chimed in that she did not mind either, which sent Kim into an immediate and flustered protest. She insisted that her brother, however calm and reasonable he was compared to most men, was still a man, and she was firmly opposed to any such situation. Yoshio watched this play out in the log, and thought to himself that it was fairly obvious Kim's concern had very little to do with protecting Lyra and Carol's dignity. He also thought privately that the depth of her attachment to her brother was something else entirely. He wondered aloud whether all of their conversations were going to be this unremarkable. Then Lyra shifted the topic to something heavier. She brought up the monster attack, and wondered aloud what could have caused such a large horde to descend on their village in the first place. What had actually happened on that day, when everything fell apart? Yoshio sat up at that, puzzled by the reference. Kim responded thoughtfully, pointing out that their village had not been a small one by any means. The stone walls surrounding it had been solid and sturdy, giving it better odds than most settlements. It had also been home to many hunters, including her brother. And yet none of that had been enough. Carol added a quiet, worried thought about whether the people who had lived nearby had managed to survive. Yoshio was left genuinely confused and wanted to understand what had actually happened. He dug further back through the conversation logs and gradually pieced together the story from what he found there. The 5 villagers had originally lived in a large and well-established village with hundreds of residents. One day, a massive horde of monsters had appeared and attacked. The villagers had fought back as best they could, but eventually the situation became hopeless, and they were forced to flee. A number of wagons had managed to escape together initially, but at some point his 5 villagers had been separated from the rest of the group. They had managed to shake off most of the pursuing monsters by heading into the forest, though the journey had taken a serious toll on their wagon, leaving them unable to travel much further. Yoshio leaned back and took it all in. That was their backstory, he thought. It also explained one of the miracles he had seen listed, the option to reunite with escaped villagers. He felt a renewed sense of purpose looking at them on screen. He told himself quietly but firmly that he would find a way to get them back to the others someday. Just then, his mother's voice called up from downstairs, letting him know that dinner was ready. Yoshio felt a small flush of self-consciousness and slowly made his way down to the dining room. He stopped slightly when he got there. His father was already sitting at the table, which was unusual. His father was rarely home this early in the evening. In truth, Yoshio barely saw his father more than a couple of times a month since he had withdrawn from regular life. When they did cross paths, his father would ask something brief and simple like how he was doing, and that was about the extent of it. They had fought once, a serious and lasting fight, and ever since then the distance between them had settled into something permanent. His father was not unkind about it. He was polite enough. But Yoshio had the distinct feeling that his father had come to see him more as a stranger in the house than as a son. His father asked whether his sister Sayuki was working overtime again that evening. His mother confirmed that it seemed that way. His father received this with a brief and quiet acknowledgement. Yoshio thought about his sister as he sat down. She was younger than him, but she had built a real career for herself, doing work she genuinely loved. She did not even mind the long hours, from what he had heard her say. She was living exactly the life she had chosen. Yoshio sat with that thought for a moment without saying anything. His mother then remembered something and changed the subject entirely, mentioning that their neighbor Okiku had given them some homemade pickled vegetables and asking if anyone wanted some. She explained that the nice weather that day had prompted her to take a walk to the park, where she had run into Okiku and ended up helping her with her shopping. Yoshio thought to himself, as his mother talked, that her stories tended to be fairly one-sided in the telling. He reflected on the neighbor she had mentioned. Okiku was an elderly woman who owned a large and very old traditional house in the neighborhood. When Yoshio was young, he and his friends used to go there to play, and Okiku always had sweets ready for them. Their own house was nowhere near as grand as Okiku's, but it was still a decent size with a lawn and plenty of space. Space that was currently occupied by someone who contributed nothing. He thought with quiet and self-directed bitterness about how his father had worked hard to pay for that house, and silently acknowledged his gratitude for it, even if he could not say it out loud. He stood up from the table and complimented his mother on the meal. His mother then suggested bringing out the pudding he had bought earlier, wondering if his father would like some, and mentioning that Yoshio had picked it up for the family. His father said nothing at first. Yoshio stole a quiet sideways glance at him. Then his father said that was kind and agreed to have some. Yoshio let out a small, quiet breath of relief at that. After finishing the pudding, he went back to his room. He checked on the villagers and found that everyone except Gams had settled inside the wagon for the night. Gams was keeping watch again, just as he had the night before. Yoshio thought to himself that Gams was remarkably steady and dependable, the strong and silent type, a rock of a person. He thought briefly of someone the character reminded him of, but pushed the thought aside. He also noted that nobody else in the group was built for fighting. Kim could likely cast some healing spells, but when it came to actually defending the group, Gams was the only one who could truly stand up against a threat. Yoshio muttered that both the villagers and he himself had an enormous amount depending on that one man. He thought about their need for more capable people. He knew he could spend fate points to bring additional people into the village, but it took a very large number of points to do so in any controlled way. There was a cheaper option, a random spawn, but that was an enormous gamble. There was every chance he could end up introducing violent criminals into the group, which could end the game entirely. He decided firmly that staying away from the random option was the sensible choice. He also still wanted to summon a familiar, but felt that the right move was to hold his fate points in reserve for a genuine emergency rather than spend them now. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration, thinking to himself that it was just a game, so why was every decision feeling so difficult and weighty? He decided to leave it all for the morning. He was genuinely tired after his unusually active day of going outside and getting things done. He glanced at the monitor one last time, wished Gams a quiet good night, and prepared to go to sleep. But just as he was settling in, the game speakers blared loudly with an alert sound. Yoshio immediately spun back to the screen in alarm. An attack alert had been triggered. On screen, Gams was already awake and alert, shouting for everyone inside the wagon to stay where they were and not to step outside under any circumstances. He called on Cam to keep the others safe. The rest of the group reacted in an instant. Rod Ice urgently directed Lyra and Carol to the back of the wagon and told them to stay down. Carol asked in a worried voice whether her brother was going to be all right. Gams told her briefly and firmly that he would handle it. Kim asked to go with him. Gams refused just as firmly, telling her she was the only one among them with healing magic and that she needed to stay and look after the others. Kim's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded and stayed. Yoshio was at the edge of his seat, shouting at the screen that Gams needed to watch out and that it was too dark to see what was out there. Then shapes emerged from the darkness. Monsters, drooling and staring. Two of them stood facing Gams. Yoshio exclaimed that there really were monsters after all. A status window appeared on his screen, identifying them as black wolves. The description explained that these creatures were believed to have once been ordinary wild dogs before becoming monsters. They were more dangerous and powerful than their non-monstrous counterparts, and some of them even carried venom in their fangs. Yoshio absorbed this information with growing alarm. Monstrous wolves, and two of them against one person. Gams settled into a fighting stance as the creatures approached slowly. Yoshio found himself urging Gams on under his breath, then caught himself and snapped back to the reality of the situation. He was supposed to be the god here, not a spectator. He needed to act and use a miracle. Before he could make a decision, one of the black wolves launched itself at Gams from behind. But Gams was fast. He swung his sword in a sharp arc, catching the creature mid-leap and sending it crashing hard to the ground. The wolf growled in pain, its body twitching as it struggled to get back up. Gams did not hesitate. He stepped forward and drove his sword through it with finality. Yoshio watched in amazement and let out a cry of relief. But the moment the fight appeared to be over, Kim burst out of the wagon, calling out to her brother. Gams managed a brief response, telling her she needed to take care of the others. Then he collapsed to the ground. Kim screamed his name in horror. Yoshio was on his feet, both hands gripping the monitor as he stared at the screen in disbelief. Gams had won. He had taken down both wolves. But now he was down, and the situation had suddenly become far more desperate than it had seemed just moments before. Yoshio cried out at the screen, willing Gams to get up. Kim knelt beside her brother, screaming his name and crying out that he was getting very cold. On the other side of the screen, Yoshio was frozen in shock, demanding to know what was wrong and urging Gams to respond. Radai stepped in and told Kim to try calm down. He checked Gams over carefully and found that while he still had a pulse, his body temperature had dropped dangerously low and his color was fading. Radai examined the wound on Gams's arm and looked at the coloring around it, then turned to look at the black wolf. He concluded that Gams had been poisoned somehow and immediately asked Kim whether she knew any healing magic that could counter poison. Yoshio heard the word healing magic from behind his screen and felt an immediate wave of relief. Of course, healing magic would sort this out. Gams will be fine. But Kim's reply shattered that hope. She had not yet learned those particular spells. She turned to Rodice and asked desperately whether there were any antidotes in their supplies. Rodice was silent for a heavy moment and then shook his head. They had none. Carol, who had been listening to everything, stared with wide and tearful eyes. Kim muttered in disbelief and then broke down completely, crying out to her brother over and begging him not to leave her. Through her tears, she cried out to the god of fate, pleading with everything she had for the god to save her brother, to do whatever was necessary, and not to let him die. Yoshio watched from behind the screen with rising panic. He asked himself frantically what he was supposed to do. If Gams died, the rest of the group would not be able to survive on their own for long. He needed to act. He reminded himself sharply that he was the god in this situation, and that if he lost his composure, now the villagers had no chance at all. A miracle was his best and only real option. He went through the list quickly in his mind, dismissing the merchant and the hunters as unhelpful in this moment. Then he found it, the option to spawn a traveling physician. That was exactly what they needed. At 300 fate points, it was a significant cost, but a physician would almost certainly carry an antidote. There was no guarantee the physician would arrive in time, but it was the best move available to him. He clicked the option without hesitating further. From outside his room, his mother's voice called out, telling him to keep the noise down and asking if he had any idea what time it was. Yoshio ignored her completely. He looked at the clock and realized it was already past midnight. He thought quickly and typed something out on the keyboard. A prophecy to make the physician's sudden appearance seem less suspicious to the group. Moments later, on screen, an unfamiliar woman appeared outside the wagon. She had a crossbody bag and introduced herself calmly as a traveling physician. Kim spun around and demanded to know who she was. Rodice raised his sword with a trembling hand. The woman remained completely calm and repeated that she was simply a traveling physician and that there was no need for alarm. The group exchanged uncertain glances with one another. Yoshio said to himself that he could not blame them for being suspicious, but he had prepared for this. He entered the prophecy he had typed, and instantly the book in Kim's hands glowed brightly. The pages turned on their own. Kim was startled to receive a prophecy in the middle of the night, but she read it immediately. The words moved her deeply and fresh tears fell from her eyes as she expressed her profound gratitude to the god of fate. Rodice glanced over at her reaction. The physician spoke again, saying quietly that it appeared this was exactly where she was meant to be, and asked if she might be permitted to examine the wounded man. Rodice, still flustered and uncertain, struggled to respond. The physician stepped forward and stood before Kim, who looked at her for a long moment before simply asking her to please save her brother. The physician knelt down beside Gams without further delay. Carol prayed quietly off to one side, willing Gams to be all right. The physician gently took hold of Gams's wounded wrist and examined it carefully. She reached into her bag and produced a tube of medicine. She let Gams drink some of it and then poured the rest directly onto his wound. The group fell into a tense and silent wait, watching for any sign of change. Gradually, after a few long moments, Gams's condition began to visibly improve. The color came back to his face, and the tension that had gripped everyone slowly began to lift. Kim cried out that his face had returned to normal, her voice cracking with relief. On the other side of the screen, Yoshio exhaled a long and shaky sigh of relief. He was enormously glad it had worked and that the physician had arrived in time. He glanced at the physician on screen again and was not entirely sure of the person's gender, but felt deeply grateful to them regardless. Rodice looked over at Kim, who was still trembling, and then his eyes landed on the book. He read the prophecy that had appeared. It told them that through the faith of his followers, the god had sent a physician to their side, declaring that it was far too early for their brave soldier to enter the god's presence, and that mercy was being granted so that he might live. It assured them that the god was watching over them through every trial they faced. Yoshio thought to himself that he hoped it had sounded convincingly godlike. Rodice announced to the others that the god of fate had sent the physician to them. Yoshio settled back with a quiet sigh and told himself to keep watch through the rest of the night while the others rested. The next day arrived. Carol and Lyra were out gathering fruit together. Carol asked her mother whether the fruit might help Gams feel better and recover faster. Lyra thought about it warmly and said she believed it just might. Meanwhile, Radai stood tense and alert outside, feeling the weight of being the one responsible for protecting everyone now that Gams was down. When the bushes nearby rustled suddenly, Radai let out a startled yelp, only to find that it was nothing more than a rabbit. He let out a shaky breath of relief. Inside, the physician was quietly and methodically preparing medicine, grinding herbs in focused silence while Gams remained unconscious nearby. Kim watched her for a moment and then asked carefully how the physician had managed to find them all the way out here. The physician glanced at her and began to explain. Medicine had been the family trade for generations. The area they were in was known locally as the Forbidden Forest, a place where monsters were abundant, but where medicinal plants also grew in equally abundant supply. The physician had come there the previous night to gather herbs and had been nearly finished and about to make camp when a pillar of light appeared in the distance. There had been a moment of hesitation about whether to follow it or not, but something deep inside had stirred and compelled the physician forward. Following that feeling had led directly to them. Kim told the physician warmly that it must have been the god of fate who had guided the physician to them. The physician responded thoughtfully, explaining that the people of their tradition did not worship any god above nature itself. That said, the physician acknowledged that perhaps some god's hand had indeed turned their steps in the right direction the night before. Yoshio watched the exchange quietly from behind a screen and noted to himself that the physician seemed to be something of an atheist, or at least someone who believed gods might exist but did not place much personal importance on them. Kim then asked whether the physician would be moving on soon. The physician replied that it was not possible to leave a patient before knowing they had fully recovered, and expressed a wish to remain with the group for a while, provided the others had no objection. Kim responded with immediate warmth and told the physician to please stay as long as they liked, though she added with some embarrassment that space inside the wagon was quite limited and comfort could not be guaranteed. Yoshio thought to himself that having a physician around would make his own job considerably easier. At the same time, he recognized a practical problem. The wagon was already at capacity, and with one more person joining the group, someone would have to sleep outside. The group had survived the monster attack the night before, but they could not hold out like that indefinitely. If more black wolves appeared while Gams was still recovering, it could very well be the end of everything. Gams was going to be out of action for at least a few days. Radai meant well, but Yoshio was not confident in his ability to hold off monsters alone. What the group needed more than anything right now was somewhere genuinely safe to go. He wondered whether he could arrange that with fate points. Before he could think it through further, the physician made a suggestion. There was an abandoned mining camp located in a nearby cave that would provide solid shelter from the weather and the elements. With some luck, the miners might even have left behind furnishings of some kind. Yoshio reacted internally with pure excitement. He had already been grateful when the physician turned out to know the area well, but this felt like an incredible stroke of luck. A safe and sheltered place to rest and recover was exactly what the villagers needed at that moment. Radai immediately urged the physician to lead them there without any delay. They loaded everyone into the wagon and set off. Yoshio noted with pleasant surprise that the cave was only about 5 minutes away from where they had been camped, which meant they could easily come back to retrieve the lumber they had gathered whenever they were ready. They arrived at the entrance of the abandoned camp before long and stood looking at it. The physician explained that the larger door had been used to bring in carts during the mine's active years, but the smaller door would serve their needs just fine. The mine was no longer in operation, having been abandoned when a richer vein of or was discovered somewhere else. Inside, the physician told them they would find the miners' old living quarters and storage space. Radai and the physician pushed the door open together. The physician tapped one of the lamps, and it came to life immediately, with the other lamps in the space lighting up one after another in quick succession. The room filled with warm light. Radai stared in amazement, and Carol burst out with excited exclamations, bouncing with energy at the sight of it all. Yoshio looked at the space on screen and muttered that it was much larger than he had expected. It was rough around the edges, certainly, but compared to living in a horse-drawn wagon, it was a substantial improvement in every way. Radai pointed out that there were even separate bedrooms carved into the rock, and the physician explained that the miners had dug those out themselves, wanting a degree of personal space during their long stretches of work. The discovery sent Radai and Carol into another round of excited reactions. Yoshio watched them all with a quiet smile, thinking that everyone was so caught up in the excitement of a new space that they had stopped listening to the physician entirely. Kim sat beside her unconscious brother and spoke softly to him, telling him they had made it safely to a new place and asking him to please recover quickly. Lyra moved through the space and discovered that water flowed in from a natural spring. She also found a stone oven and noted that there was just about everything they needed to cook a proper meal. With a little work, she told the others it could feel just like home. Carol responded with bright enthusiasm, and Lyra immediately took charge, announcing that it was time to get everything cleaned up. Yoshio watched contentedly and thought to himself that the group now had a proper base with a solid roof overhead. He felt a deep sense of gratitude toward the traveling physician who had made all of this possible. In one of the carved-out rooms, the physician was already quietly at work preparing more medicine while Gams lay resting nearby. Lyra organized a group and told everyone to keep the noise down so as not to disturb Gams. She set the goal of getting the cave so clean and welcoming that he would think he had woken up somewhere wonderful. Everyone agreed and set to work. She directed Rod Eyes to take anything that could not be used outside the cave, and Rod Eyes pointed out that some of the old materials could actually be used for repairs before anything was moved. Meanwhile, Carol moved quietly through the space, counting the rooms to herself. She found 4 and immediately claimed one in her mind, announcing cheerfully to herself that it could be shared between her and Gams since she was still quite small and one bed would be plenty for both of them. She giggled to herself at the thought. Kim, who was nearby, fixed Carol with a sharp and pointed stare. Yoshio watched and thought to himself that Kim's expression was beginning to unsettle even him a little. Kim muttered under her breath that the girl had no chance, because if Gams was sharing a room with anyone, it would naturally be with his sister. She reminded herself that nothing would come of it regardless since Carol was just a child, but she still found it entirely beyond her understanding why Gams humored Carol at all. In her view, such forwardness should be firmly and flatly rejected, child or not. Lyra, who had been quietly approaching from behind Kim, was just about to say something. Yoshio observed the whole dynamic and thought to himself that the relationship between Kim and Carol was a little on the unhealthy side. But overall, they all got along well enough, and that was what mattered. Now that the cave was being sorted into something genuinely livable, the shelter problem was essentially solved for the foreseeable future. It was finally time, he thought with satisfaction, to start actually building something, to put the village into the village simulation. He let out a long sigh of relief and stretched his arms and back. He noticed it was already noon and decided he had spent enough time at the screen for now. He was hungry as well. He got up to see what was in the fridge and moved toward it, opening the door at the same moment that another door opened from the other side. He stopped. His sister Sayuki was standing there. A small, dry sound escaped her as she took in the sight of him and remarked that he was apparently still alive. Yoshio said her name quietly, caught completely off guard. Sayuki told him she was trying to get downstairs for breakfast and asked whether he felt like moving out of the way. Yoshio hesitated for a moment before saying he was heading down there as well. Sayuki replied that he had not mentioned that. He went downstairs anyway. Sayuki told him to stay out of the downstairs bathroom, and Yoshio replied that he already knew she used it. A memory flashed through Sayuki's mind, the image of her brother protecting her. A question surfaced briefly in her thoughts about what kind of person that made her now, but she pushed it away before it could take hold. Yoshio said he had no intention of using her precious bathroom and told her to relax. Sayuki looked at him and said with frustration that he could at least stick up for himself once in a while because his lack of resistance was embarrassing to witness. The door slammed shut behind her. Alone in his room, Yoshio sat with the question of what had gotten into her. She seemed even more on edge than usual. Ever since the stalking incident, the two of them had barely been able to be in the same room together without the tension becoming unbearable. It had not always been that way. There was a time when they had actually spent time together the way real siblings did. More than that, almost like genuine friends. That felt impossible to imagine now. He could not stop himself from wondering whether, if none of it had ever happened, they might still have that easy closeness today. His stomach ached with the thought of it. He told himself firmly to stop dwelling on it, because going over it again was not going to fix anything. He decided to check in on the villagers one more time before calling it a day. Inside the mine on screen, the group had clearly been busy. Lyra looked tired, but satisfied with the work that had been done. Rod Ice asked where Kim had gone. Rod Ice answered his own question a moment later, recalling that she had said she was going to check on Gams. Carol immediately complained that it was not fair and declared that she wanted to go see Gams too, asking if she could come along. Rod Eyes told her not just yet, explaining that the two of them deserved a little time alone. Carol thought it over for a brief moment and accepted it. Rod Eyes then turned the situation around by suggesting that the two of them go exploring together instead, pointing out that when Gams was fully recovered, Carol could show him everything she had already discovered. Carol warmed to the idea and agreed. In another part of the mine, the physician named Muris was quietly documenting notes when Kim appeared and apologized for interrupting. She gently encouraged Muris to take a break and offered to sit with her brother for a while. Muris leaned over Gams one last time and observed that the poison's effects were indeed weakening. She accepted the offer and told Kim before leaving not to hesitate to call if anything changed. Kim promised she would not and thanked Muris. She then sat beside her brother and took his hand gently, speaking softly to him and telling him she was there, that he could rest easy. Yoshio watched and felt reassured that Gams was stable enough to be left for a while. Then something caught his eye. A new feature had appeared on the interface that he had not noticed before. It was labeled simply as Dream. He stared at it with curiosity, wondering what it could mean. It must have appeared because Gams was dreaming, he thought. He wondered what would happen if he clicked on it, and decided to find out. What appeared on his screen made his eyes go wide. It looked like a cutscene was playing out. The scene inside Gams' dream was set in what appeared to be a shop or trading post of some kind. Yoshio wondered aloud where the location was. He watched as a younger-looking version of Gams walked inside and went straight to the counter. Yoshio thought to himself that this must be Gams as a boy, and that the adult Gams was dreaming about his past. The cashier at the counter congratulated the young Gams on completing his first quest and handed over his bounty for the monsters he had dealt with. Gams thanked the cashier. As he turned to leave, a group of hunters called out to him, inviting him to join them at the tavern and telling him the drinks were on them. The young Gams thanked them but declined, saying his sister was waiting for him at home. He sent them off with cheerful well wishes and headed out on his own. Yoshio watched and assumed that the sister Gams had mentioned was chemistry. He also noticed something. The young version of Gams on screen was not at all the quiet and reserved person he had come to know. He seemed lighter, more open. Yoshio thought to himself that Gams had apparently not always been the strong and silent type. Gams ran the whole way home. When he got inside, his father was already there, drinking. His father looked up and addressed him with little interest. Gams observed out loud that his father was drinking again. Without warning, his father flung a glass of wine at him. Gams ducked just in time to avoid the worst of it. His father demanded to know what kind of tone that was to use with a parent. Gams straightened up and wiped small fragments of glass from his face without saying anything more. Gams threw a bag of coins onto the table and reminded his father of their agreement. His father was supposed to watch over Kim while Gams was out working. His father poured the coins across the table carelessly, more interested in the money than in anything else, remarking that it was more than enough for him to treat himself to something good. Gams demanded to know where Kim was. His father said nothing. The two of them went down to the storeroom. What Gams found there stopped him cold. Kim was lying on the floor in a hopeless state, barely conscious. Gams rushed to her immediately and gathered her up in his arms, calling her name urgently and telling her to say something. Kim responded faintly, asking in a weak and disoriented voice whether it was really Gams. He asked her how many days it had been since she had last eaten. She could barely answer. Yoshio watched the whole scene from behind the screen and reacted with visible distress. He could not believe what he was seeing. It was straightforward abuse, plain and simple. There was no other way to describe it. Gams held Kim close and apologized quietly, telling her he should have gotten her out of that place a long time ago. He lifted her carefully and told her they were leaving. Their father stepped forward to stop them, fumbling over his words and trying to pass the whole thing off as nothing more than having had too much to drink and forgetting himself, promising it would never happen again. Gams turned and looked at his father with cold and steady anger, telling him to get out of their way or face the consequences. Their father stepped aside without another word. Gams carried Kim out of the storeroom and into the night. It was the middle of winter, and snow was falling as he walked through the streets with her in his arms. Kim asked him quietly where they were going. Gams told her simply that anywhere was better than where they had just come from. Kim worried that going back might be the safer option, afraid of what their father would do in anger. Gams told her firmly to let him be angry, and that she would never have to see that man again. There was nothing left to be afraid of. Kim asked him something that had clearly been weighing on her for a long time, whether their parents hated her because they had always been so cruel to her, and she could not understand what she had done to deserve it. Gams answered her with equal firmness, telling her without any hesitation that she had done absolutely nothing wrong and that she should never blame herself. The fault lay entirely with their parents, not with her. Kim's voice broke as she told him what their parents had said to her, that she was so worthless and troublesome that they would sell her to slavers, and that it was the only thing she would ever be good for. Yoshio flinched at hearing that. He thought to himself that the game did not hold back when it came to the darker parts of its characters' histories. Gams stopped walking and looked at Kim directly. He told her that those people were no longer their parents. They did not deserve to be called that anymore. He told her to forget them entirely. From that point on, it would be just the two of them, no one else. He asked her what she thought of that. Kim looked up at him through her emotions and smiled. She told him that as long as she had him, that was everything she needed. Gams responded with warmth and encouragement. Kim added softly that she loved him very much. Yoshio sat back from the screen and let everything he had just seen settle over him. Now he understood. Kim's intense attachment to her brother made complete and total sense in the light of what they had been through together. He thought to himself that he genuinely could not blame her. If he had a brother like Gams, someone who showed up without fail and put everything on the line for the people he loved, he would count on that person for everything too. On screen, Kim gently pressed Gams's hand to her face. Gams called her name softly. He asked her quietly whether he had made her worry. Kim looked up and her eyes went wide. Her brother's eyes were open. He had woken up. She immediately pulled him into a tight embrace and expressed her overwhelming relief and gratitude. The other villagers who had been watching nearby broke into smiles and quiet celebration of their own. Yoshio stretched his arms out and let out a long, satisfied breath. He was genuinely relieved. The whole group was happy, and understandably so. Gams was the most solid and dependable person they had. He thought to himself that Gams was the very definition of a beloved main character, strong, steadfast, and handsome, everything that a person like that should be. He laughed a little to himself, adding that Gams was also nothing like him in any of those ways. But what struck him most deeply was the kind of brother Gams was, someone who was ready at any moment to put his life on the line for the person he cared about. That was a brother a person could truly count on. Yoshio was certain that the bond between Gams and Kim would never waver for even a moment. It was only then that he noticed something. He reached up and touched the area under his eyes. They were wet. He had been crying without realizing it. He stared at the moisture on his fingers for a moment, and then laughed quietly at himself, shaking his head as he wiped his face. But the laughter faded quickly. A thought settled over him, quiet and heavy. If he felt strongly enough about what he had watched to be moved to tears by it, then why? Why had he never done anything about his own situation? Why had he just sat still all these years? The question hit him harder than he expected. Yoshio put his head down on the desk and let the tears come properly this time, no longer holding them back. Through them, he told himself with everything he had that he needed to change. He had to. The gate outside opened. Sayuki announced that they were heading out. Yoshio watched from his room as his sister noticed their father's necktie and asked if it was the one she had given him some time ago. Their father confirmed it was and asked if it looked all right. Sayuki said it really suited him. Yoshio sat quietly in his room and watched the two of them leave together. He turned back to his desk and sat down at his computer. In the game, Lyra was busy cooking. She called out to Carol and asked her to set the table so that everything would be ready when Gams and the others returned from their patrol. Carol agreed cheerfully and got to work. Yoshio reflected on how things had progressed. It had been 3 days since the villagers had moved into the cave. They had managed to gather all the furniture and supplies they needed to get by comfortably, which was a significant improvement from where they had been living before. He had spent a considerable amount of real money to earn enough fate points to use the miracle that had made it all possible. But looking at what the group had now, he felt it had been worth every bit of it. And yet, he thought, the cave itself had really only been a bonus compared to what he considered the true miracle. On screen, Gams was out on patrol and had come face to face with a monster. As the monster moved to strike, Gams raised his sword and managed to block the blow, though the monster continued pushing against him with considerable force. Then Murus appeared from nowhere, drew a bow, and sent an arrow flying directly into the monster's eye. The creature dropped dead on the spot. Murus approached Gams afterward and reminded him firmly that he was still recovering and needed to be careful not to push himself too hard. Gams acknowledged that he owed Murus yet again and offered his sincere thanks. Yoshio thought to himself that Murus was the real miracle, the traveling physician he had summoned with those 300 fate points. On top of extraordinary skill with medicine, Murus turned out to be just as capable with a bow as Gams was with a sword. That was not all. Murus also possessed a degree of plant-controlling magic that had already proven invaluable. All of the logs they had chopped down would normally have taken months to dry out properly before they could be used as lumber. Murus had managed it in seconds. Murus had also been the one who knew about the cave in the first place. The physician was, by any measure, remarkably overpowered. Yoshio said to himself that he could absolutely use someone like that as a permanent member of the village. But there was a catch. Murus was technically a guest character, which meant Yoshio could not see all of the physician's details on a screen, and the game offered no indication of how to make Murus a permanent villager. 30,000 yen worth of fate points had not even bought him a permanent member. He thought to himself that the game was quite unforgiving in that regard. Back in the cave, the villagers were preparing food together. Gams and Murus returned from their patrol, carrying the fresh remains of the monster they had dealt with. Kim greeted her brother and Murus warmly, and noted from the look of things that the patrol had gone well. Carol ran over to greet them too. Gams confirmed it had been productive. Rod Eyes asked about what they had brought back, and Gams confirmed it was a fresh kill. Lyra immediately brightened at the prospect of meat for dinner, though she quickly pointed out the problem. They were running low on salt and spices, leaving them little to season the meal with, and even less for preserving the meat. Murus agreed that the supply situation was concerning. Yoshio acknowledged to himself that the shortage of salt and spices had come up before, and that it was a real problem. Setting that aside for the moment, he thought there was probably enough to hunt and forage around the cave to keep them going for now. But what they genuinely needed was a more stable and sustainable source of food, which meant starting to grow crops from nothing. And for that they would need seeds. The salt and spice shortage also needed addressing. He began weighing the idea of spending fate points to summon a traveling merchant. But then another miracle option caught his attention and held it firmly. It was the option to summon a familiar golem. In games, golems were typically large humanoid constructs made from solid material, and Yoshio immediately saw the appeal. A golem could fight when needed and work without stopping for rest. It would solve 2 problems at once. And then there was what he considered the real appeal of the option. He could directly control the golem himself. Up until this point, he had been forced to sit back and watch events unfold from a distance, responding only through prophecies and miracles. With a golem under his direct control, he could actually get into the action and participate in a meaningful way. The only problem was the cost. 700 fate points was the price, which in real money worked out to 70,000 yen. Yoshio sat back and did the math on where he currently stood. It had taken 300 fate points to summon Murus, which had nearly wiped him out completely. Since then, Gams had recovered and the daily prophecies had been well received, earning him extra gratitude from the villagers. He was now sitting at around 160 fate points and earning roughly 10 more each day from the villagers' ongoing faith. At that rate, without spending anything, it would take approximately 2 months to save up enough for the golem. He found that prospect deeply frustrating. He could accumulate points faster by spending real money, but his savings were completely gone. He had an old piggy bank with a small amount left in it, and some loose change from the occasional times his father had been in a generous mood. He had promised himself he would be more careful with money, but everything he had managed to set aside had already gone into the game. The villagers gathered and ate their meal together. Watching them share the moment with warmth and ease, Yoshio felt happy too. He got up from his chair with a groan and decided it was time for a coffee break. A little while later, he was back at his desk with a mug in his hands. He thought to himself that Kim and Gams had been building something over the past couple of days, and he had not yet figured out what it was. He looked at the screen. Kim was carefully placing a flower beside what turned out to be a small statue she had made. She was clearly tired from the effort, but satisfied with the result. She asked her brother whether he thought the god of fate would be displeased with such a humble representation. Gams patted her head gently and told her that the thought behind it was what mattered, and that the god of fate would understand the intention even from something simple. Miras came over and asked whether it was an altar with an image of their god. Kim confirmed that it was, and admitted with some embarrassment that it was a very humble tribute. But she felt they needed a proper space for worship and offerings, however modest. Yoshio looked at the statue on screen and realized with a quiet surprise that it was meant to be him, or rather their idea of the god of fate. The carving was rough and a little unfinished, but he still found it genuinely touching. The details were too imprecise to clearly indicate whether the figure was meant to be male or female, but that did not really matter. He thought to himself that he had simply been behaving as a god should, and apparently that was impression enough for them to want to honor it. Kim knelt before the statue and offered a quiet prayer, asking the god of fate to accept the modest gifts she was placing there. She set a collection of fruit at the base of the statue. At that very moment, a brilliant and powerful beam of magical light appeared out of nowhere. The group was startled by the sudden appearance of the light. Kim prayed quietly, offering their gifts to the god with reverence. Yoshio watched from behind a screen and thought to himself that if he had seen something vanish in a thin air like that in real life, he would have been completely beside himself with shock. He wondered whether the villagers were taking it so calmly simply because gods were an accepted reality in their world. Then he noticed something on his interface that genuinely surprised him. His fate point total had gone up. He stared at it for a moment and realized it must have come from the offering. The more valuable the item offered, the more faith points he would receive. The villagers had worked hard to give him a gift, and he had gained points from it. He caught himself quickly when he thought about it that way, recognizing that it made him sound rather self-serving. But regardless of how it looked, receiving points through offerings was a significant discovery that changed how he thought about the game. The logical move would be to ask the villagers to send him their most valuable items in order to maximize his points. But he immediately pushed that thought aside. He did not want to make things harder on them than they already were. He needed to make sure he was not encouraging them to sacrifice things they genuinely needed. With that in mind, he composed the day's prophecy carefully. When Kim read it aloud to the gathered group, it told them that their offerings and devotion had been received and that their praise pleased the god greatly. But it also told them not to burden themselves in their giving, and that their words of faith were the most precious offering of all. Only true surpluses, things they would not miss, should be offered in a material sense. It was through both their devotion and whatever they could spare that miracles could be granted unto them. Yoshio hoped it had come across clearly, though he worried it might have sounded a little too eager. Radice was moved and expressed amazement that their god was so considerate and humble. Gams observed that the god was speaking directly to them as ordinary people. Yoshio thought to himself with some amusement that if these villagers ended up in the real world, they would probably be easily taken advantage of by any con artist claiming divine authority. He then acknowledged quietly to himself that what he was doing was not entirely different from that, which was a slightly uncomfortable thought. The next day, Yoshio watched with curiosity as Radice called Gams over to help him with something. The two men heaved a large log between them, and Radice asked Gams whether they thought they could spare it. Gams said they should be fine, since thanks to Miras they had more than enough wood. Yoshio was surprised to see them bringing a log as an offering. The two of them knelt together and prayed, and the brilliant light appeared once more. The log vanished completely. Yoshio stared at his screen, noting with amazement that there appeared to be no size limit on what could be offered. The villagers had already given something the day before, and here they were doing it again. He shook his head with a mixture of disbelief and appreciation, wondering to himself whether sending gifts to their god was genuinely how they chose to spend their time. He stretched his arms and shoulders and noted how long he had been sitting at the screen. The game was a serious time investment, no question about it. He called out to his mother, who told him there was a package waiting for him. Yoshio thought it was probably something he could have picked up at the store rather than having delivered, but he went downstairs anyway, assuming he must have won another online contest. When he opened the door and accepted the box from the deliverman, he looked at the label and froze. It was from the Village of Fate. He stared at it. Something had been sent to him from inside the game. He told himself immediately that was impossible and tried to think rationally. It was obviously just additional materials from the company, a playtester's guide, or a manual they had forgotten to include with the original package. He smiled to himself and let out a small, dry laugh at having even considered anything else for a moment. His mother appeared and noticed the package, asking what he was muttering about. Before he could respond, she spotted the contents, a strange-looking fruit that she had never seen before. She held it up with curiosity, noting the unusual shape and the color, somewhere between a pear and an apple, and said she had never come across anything like it. Yoshio went cold when the memory hit him, the fruit that Kim had placed as an offering at the altar. His mother, completely unaware of his reaction, asked whether it was some kind of regional delicacy from another part of the country, and remarked that he had finally won something genuinely useful for once. She asked if she could put the rest out for dessert that evening. Yoshio told her to go ahead. He walked away and bit into one of the fruits himself. It looked somewhat like an apple, but there was a faint citrus quality to it as well, a combination that was unlike anything he had tasted before. It was clearly not artificial. Whatever it was, he could understand why the villagers liked it. Each bite was better than the last. He told himself it was probably just a thank you gift from the developers, or perhaps a novelty fruit from another country that was simply unfamiliar to most Japanese people. Either way, it was delicious and it had cost him nothing. He was not going to complain about that. The following morning, Yoshio returned to the game and sat down to compose the day's prophecy. He addressed the villagers' offering from the previous day, telling them that while he did not require food for sustenance as a god, he did take pleasure in what they shared, and he was grateful. He told them he would not ask more than they were able to give, and that he was aware of how precious food was to them. He instructed them that when food was scarce, offerings of other things they no longer needed would be entirely sufficient, and that if making offerings felt like a burden, they were not required to do it every day. He left the choice entirely to their own judgment. Privately, he thought to himself that he needed to save up his fate points for the golem, and he promised himself he would make it up to the villagers once he had it. On screen, Kim was quietly tending to the altar, cleaning around the statue with gentle care. Yoshio was still watching when his mother's voice suddenly came from downstairs, calling for him with a sharpness in her tone that suggested something was wrong. She told him to get down there immediately. He wondered what had happened. His mother's voice carried the distinct edge of someone who was genuinely upset about something. When he came out of his room and went outside, his mother was standing there pointing at something with an expression caught between bewilderment and frustration. She demanded to know what he was planning to do with it. Yoshio looked in the direction she was pointing. Sitting outside the house was a large log. He stared at it. He could not process what he was seeing. If it was a prank, he thought, it had long since stopped being funny. Yoshio tried to lift the log and was immediately struck by how extraordinarily heavy it was. His mother stood nearby, watching with a mixture of shock and exasperation, demanding to know what he planned to do with it. He told her he would move it around to the backyard for now. She accepted that, though she could not resist pointing out that all the time he spent exercising instead of looking for work had at least turned out to be useful for something. Yoshio hauled the log with great effort, his body straining under the weight. As he worked, his mind went back to the very first prophecy he had ever written in the game, when he had casually told the villagers to gather timber. It had not occurred to him at the time what kind of physical effort that actually demanded of raw dice and gams. But that was beside the point right now. Whatever the connection was between the game and these physical deliveries, he could not simply brush it off as some clever promotional gimmick. He needed answers from whoever was behind the game. He searched the packaging for a phone number, but found nothing. He looked for an address instead. When he found it, he was taken aback. The package had been sent from Hokkaido. Someone had shipped a full-sized log all the way from Hokkaido to his door. He went to his room and searched for the return address to see what he could find. No company information came up at all. He plugged the address into a map search and found what appeared to be a small and ordinary building, nowhere near large enough to house the kind of team that would be needed to develop a game as technically sophisticated as the Village of Fate. The programming staff must be working somewhere else entirely. He found the whole company baffling and overly secretive, and admitted to himself that even if he wanted to go to Hokkaido to investigate in person, he could not afford to, and honestly was not sure he had the nerve for it either way. Either way, he now had a log to deal with, and that was that. The next day, another special delivery arrived. Yoshio accepted the package and noticed that it was printed with the words "Keep Cool" on the outside. He brought it to the kitchen, lifted the lid, and stared. It was raw meat. He could barely believe it. He told himself out loud that they were actually sending him raw meat now. Then the memory of what had happened in the game hit him. Gams reporting that he had taken down another monster, and Kim immediately kneeling at the altar to offer the meat to the god of fate as a blessing to be shared. Yoshio felt a chill run through him. Before he could process it further, his mother walked in and spotted the box. She began asking questions immediately, the fruit, the log, and now this. She did not know what was going on, but was certain whatever it was must be expensive. Yoshio scrambled internally for an explanation that would make sense. He told her that he had been in contact with people from a rural village through a website where local communities seek outside ideas to help develop their local economy. He had sent in some suggestions, they had liked them, and the village had been sending him local products as a way of showing their appreciation. His mother reacted with genuine warmth and excitement, finding the whole story quite wonderful. Yoshio noted to himself that it was not technically a lie. He had basically just described what his daily prophecies in the game actually were. He showed his mother the box and explained that the meat was wild boar, hunted locally by the people there, and suggested she cook it for dinner. His mother was delighted by the idea, though she had never cooked wild boar before and asked Yoshio whether he was sure it was safe to eat. The deliveries continued to arrive with remarkable regularity. He received something from the village of fate almost every single day. There were fruits of every shape he could imagine, and large quantities of what appeared to be monster meat. On one occasion, a crystal arrived that glowed when struck, the kind the villagers apparently used in place of light bulbs. And the logs kept coming. By the time the third one arrived, his mother greeted it with tired resignation, telling him it was happening again. Yoshio promised to move it right away. He thought about the situation and began developing a theory. Perhaps he had been misunderstanding the nature of the game all along. Maybe as players built up their in-game villages, the offerings sent by the villagers became increasingly rare and valuable in the real world too, making it essentially a high-end prize-based game for players with deep pockets. If that was the case, then his being selected as a tester had probably been some kind of mistake. That evening, the wild boar was cooked, and the family sat down together to eat. Yoshio's mother mentioned that she had used the meat he had received from the village and set it on the table. When she tasted it, she expressed approval. Yoshio and his father ate in silence beside her. His mother asked hopefully whether Yoshio thought they might send more of the fruit, noting that she had been feeling noticeably more energetic since eating it and suspected it might be something of superfood. Yoshio said he would try asking for some. His mother added with amusement that she had practically had to chase Sayuki out of the kitchen to keep her from eating all the meat before it made it to the table. Sayuki called from somewhere, asking whether there was enough for seconds. Their father broke his usual silence to say that the meat was genuinely good, gamier than what one found at the grocery store, but in a way that was deeply satisfying, the kind of meat that made a person feel properly alive. Yoshio noted to himself that that was more words than he had heard from his father in years. Monster meat, it turned out, was a hit. Later, outside the house, Yoshio was attempting to do something with the accumulating logs. He had so much wood piling up that he felt he ought to at least try to make use of it. He thought that learning some practical woodworking techniques might also give him useful knowledge to pass on to the villagers through future prophecies. The work, however, was considerably harder than he had anticipated, and he found himself wondering whether he was even doing it correctly. His father came outside and noticed what he was doing. He asked Yoshio what he was working on. Yoshio explained that he did not want to let all the wood go to waste, and he apologized for having helped himself to some of his father's tools without asking first. His father told him not to worry about it, and stood watching for a moment as Yoshio struggled with the work. Then, without much fanfare, his father stepped in and took over, demonstrating the proper technique. In a matter of moments, his father had done with ease what Yoshio had been laboring over, and Yoshio watched in genuine admiration, asking who had taught his father how to handle a saw like that. He observed quietly to himself that someone watching from the outside might think his father was indifferent or even annoyed, but Yoshio knew him well enough to recognize that the man was simply too shy to show how pleased he was to be asked. Despite everything, they were still family. His father handed the tools back to Yoshio and told him to try again. Yoshio took them and had another go, this time following his father's guidance. From that point on, the two of them began spending time together on weekends. They cut logs into planks and fixed the garden fence side by side. Yoshio also picked up a few cooking lessons from his mother along the way, partly so he could pass useful techniques on to the villagers through his prophecies, and partly because he was genuinely learning to cook for himself. Before long, he was sitting down to proper lunch every day. He found himself quietly thanking the villagers for the good meat that kept showing up at his door. Things with Sayuki were still not back to what they had been, but one day he managed to say something to her when they crossed paths, just a simple acknowledgement that it was good to see her. She replied in kind. It was small, but it was something. He found himself thinking about how long it had been since he had actually talked with his family like this. And it had all started because of the village of fate. He had gone into it thinking he was the one who would be helping the villagers. But lately, if he was being honest with himself, it seemed like they were the ones helping him. There was just one thing that was weighing on him when he looked at the game. The fence around the cave had been completed. Gams and Kim stood outside it, looking out. Gams noted that as long as the fence could slow enemies down even a little, he and Muris could handle the ones that made it over, provided the numbers were not too overwhelming. After what had happened last time, it was hard not to carry some worry about it. They went back inside the fence. With the barrier up, everyone should have been able to breathe easier. And yet the mood inside the cave was anything but relaxed. On the surface, everything looked peaceful and ordinary enough, but there was a tension in the air that was almost palpable. Carol looked confused by it. Even during quiet moments when everyone was just sitting and talking, something felt off. Everyone kept glancing over at the wooden calendar on the wall and sighing. One particular day on, it had a marking that looked distinctly ominous. Yoshio wondered what was going to happen when they reached that day. The group eventually gathered together. Carol asked why everyone was looking so gloomy, and one of the others echoed her sentiment. Her parents quickly put on cheerful faces and insisted everything was perfectly fine. Carol was not fooled. She pointed out that everyone kept staring at the calendar and sighing, and both Gams and Rod Ice nodded in acknowledgement that she had noticed correctly. Rod Ice moved closer to Carol and began to explain, choosing his words carefully. He did not want to frighten her, but she was growing up and deserved to understand. He asked her whether she remembered the special rules that used to apply on the last day of each month back in their old village. No playing outside, going to bed early, and never under any circumstances leaving the village boundaries. Carol remembered it well, and had always hated that day because all the adults would become especially tense and serious. Rodice told her those rules had existed to protect children like her. He then asked whether she knew where their calendar came from. Carol answered confidently, recounting what she knew. 7 gods each took turns watching over the world, 1 month at a time. She named them one by one. The god of moonlight, the god of fire, the god of water, the god of light, the god of lightning, the god of plants, and the god of earth. Yoshio made a mental note to write this down in case it turned out to be important. Rodice praised her memory, and then Carol raised a sharp observation of her own. There were more than 7 gods in 12 months in a year, which did not add up with only 7 gods dividing the calendar. Rodice was impressed by the catch, and explained that the 7 gods had originally only ruled over the days of the week, not entire months. Carol immediately recalled the names of those days, which lined up closely with the days of the week in the real world. Yoshio noted the similarity and thought their calendar systems were probably quite alike overall. Rodice continued the explanation. These 7 gods were the most powerful in existence, and were referred to as the major gods. Below them were many minor gods of various kinds, and the god of fate who watched over the villagers was one of those minor gods. Yoshio absorbed that, so he was essentially a lesser deity serving under one of the 7 major gods. That put his role in the broader picture into somewhat clearer perspective. Rodice went on to tell the story of how the current order of things had come to be. In the beginning, the 7 days simply repeated in an endless cycle. But at some point a great war broke out among the gods. For the first 31 days, a freezing wind swept across the world. On the 128th day, the god of plants gained the upper hand. Around the 182nd day, the god of water and the god of lightning fought intensely against one another. On the 243rd day, the god of fire became particularly fierce and dominant. The gods who emerged victorious from each period of the war claimed that stretch of time as their own to rule over, in addition to their original day of the week. The great battle lasted 365 days in total before it finally ended. Carol asked what had happened to the gods who lost. Rodice said that was the most important part of the story. The defeated gods were called the corrupted gods. The major gods had sealed them away deep underground, where they remain to this day, slowly gathering strength and waiting for the chance to return. Once each month, they drew power from the monsters of the world. This happened on what was known as the Day of Corruption, the very last day of each month. On that day, monsters became significantly stronger and more dangerous than usual, which was why going outdoors was so hazardous and why all those strict rules had existed back in the village. Yoshio understood immediately why the atmosphere in the cave had been so heavy. Everyone was bracing for the end of the month. He looked at the calendar on the cave wall and counted the days. It matched the real-world calendar precisely. Today was the 20th of November. November had 30 days. That left exactly 10 days until the Day of Corruption. It was the middle of the night, and Yoshio was still at his screen, thinking through whether there was any way he could scrape together enough faith points to help protect the villagers before that day arrived. Then he realized how late it had gotten and pulled himself back to the present. He noticed Rodice was still awake. Unusual, since the man was generally sound asleep by that hour. Lyra came to him, noticing that he had barely slept in days and asking gently whether something was wrong. Rodice told her he could not stop thinking about it. The last day of corruption. He said they had been lucky to survive it, and that the memory of it would not leave him alone. He was consumed by worry about what would happen if a horde that size came again, or worse, an even larger one. He was terrified of having come so far only to lose everything and everyone he loved out here in the forest. Lyra moved to comfort him. Yoshio sat back and stared at the screen. Rodice was clearly deeply shaken by whatever had happened during the last day of corruption. And Yoshio had no idea what that event had actually been, but the weight of it on Rodice's face told him it had been something truly terrible. About 3 days earlier, the morning sunlight touched Carol's sleeping face and gently woke her. She called out for her parents as she sat up, then made her way over to the chair near the vanity table. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and murmured to herself with quiet satisfaction that she was still as cute as ever. She found her parents already in the kitchen, and her father greeted her warmly. Her mother told her the princess had finally woken up and reminded her not to forget to wash her face. Carol giggled and played along with the royal joke before dashing out toward the well. She splashed cold water on her face and exclaimed that she liked it despite the chill. Then she realized she had forgotten her towel inside. She quickly figured out she could dry her hands and smooth down her hair using just her hands and felt very pleased with herself for the solution. Kim arrived and found Carol just finishing up. She asked if Carol had just woken up. Carol greeted her cheerfully and immediately asked whether her big brother Gams had come along too. Kim pointed out that Carol could have at least asked how she herself was doing before jumping straight to questions about her brother, then explained that Gams was busy guarding the village gate. Carol responded by asking what the point of Kim being there was if she had not brought Gams with her. Kim was visibly irritated by that and chased after Carol in annoyance. Carol slipped inside and closed the door behind her while Kim knocked and demanded she come back out. Lyra, hearing the commotion, asked if it had been Kim calling for her. Carol brushed it off entirely and declared it was time for breakfast. Her parents exchanged a look between themselves. Carol complimented her mother on the bread enthusiastically and then announced she was heading outside. Rod Ice immediately asked where she was going. Carol said she was going to see her big brother Gams. Rod Ice told her to stop and said not today, but Carol was already out the door before he could say another word. She made her way through the busy streets of the town. A neighbor spotted her and remarked that Carol was as lively as ever, full of energy as always. Carol greeted him back and commented on what a sunny day it was. He offered her some fruit, but she declined politely, saying she had just eaten breakfast. He asked whether Rod Ice and Lyra were at home, and Carol confirmed they had been when she left. She continued on her way until she reached the enormous wall at the edge of town. She looked up at it and murmured to herself about how impressively large it was, as she always did. Then she heard familiar voices, the guards chattering nearby. She spotted Gams among them and ran straight to him, throwing her arms around him. Gams was surprised and told her she should not be outside today. Carol could not understand why, since it seemed perfectly fine on every other day. Gams told her today was different and asked her to look around and notice whether she could see any other children playing in the streets. Carol looked, and sure enough the streets were completely empty. Even the soldiers nearby seemed on edge. Carol asked Gams whether he and all the other guards had built the Great Wall. Gams told her no, it had been left behind from a war that had taken place several thousand years ago. The whole area had once been a fortress. After the war ended, a group of refugees had come across the strong, standing walls and recognized their fortune. They had moved inside and built their homes there, and that was how the town had come to exist. Carol admitted she did not fully understand it all, but concluded simply that the wall protected them from bad people and danger. Gams confirmed that was right. Then a familiar voice called Carol's name. Lyra had come looking for her and found her at last. Carol knew she was in trouble. Before she could make a run for it, Lyra had already grabbed hold of her and began tickling her as a playful form of reprimand while Carol laughed and begged to be let go. One of the soldiers nearby asked Gams whether he knew the pair of them. Gams said yes, explaining that they were his next-door neighbors, and that while he and Kim had largely been on their own, Carol's family had always looked out for them. The soldier grumbled that they ought to know what day it was, though he added that he could not entirely blame them. The wall had never been breached before, and in that sense today was no different from any other day on the surface of things. Gams looked at Lyra and Carol as Lyra apologized for Carol coming to bother him. She told him that a proper scolding was waiting for Carol when they got home. Gams quietly told Lyra to go easy on her. As they turned to leave, Carol called back to Gams with a cheerful goodbye, telling him she would see him later. Gams replied warmly, though in a voice so quiet only he could hear it. He added to himself that there had to be a later for that to be possible. A deep rumbling sound could be heard in the distance. Back inside their home, Carol asked innocently whether something was happening, wondering if perhaps a festival was being held somewhere. Lyra told her gently that she wished that were the case, but encouraged Carol to keep her chin up and reminded her that there would be a big feast the following day. Carol's face immediately lit up with excitement at the prospect of that. Lyra caught Rod's eyes across the room, and the two of them shared a silent and heavy look. Outside, people were moving quickly and urgently. Shouts rang out to bring more boards and to hurry and block the doors. In a low voice, so Carol would not hear, Rod Ice told Lyra that he had already loaded the wagon with all their essential belongings just in case things went badly. He expressed quiet hope that the preparation would turn out to be unnecessary. Together, the two of them said a silent prayer, asking the god to watch over and protect their family, and that they might always wake to see another morning. Meanwhile, up on the wall, the signal had been given and the archers had begun to fire. On the other side of the Great Barrier, numerous goblins were struck down by the volley of arrows. A man on the watchtower called out that there were perhaps 10 or 20 goblins, nothing more than that. But another soldier immediately contradicted him, shouting that there were more goblins than he had ever seen in his life, and that they were not alone. The green goblins were working together with a larger, more aggressive type of creature. The commander roared at everyone to fall back and concentrate entirely on holding the gate. The order was to keep the monsters on the other side of the wall until they exhausted themselves. The goblins outside hammered at the gate, while others were cut down by the archers firing from above. Gams climbed up to the top of the wall, and the commander ordered everyone to follow his lead and let nothing through. But deep in the back of the goblin horde, a much larger monster lurked. It grinned with terrible intelligence. It picked up one of the goblins in its massive palm, looked upward, and hurled the goblin over the wall like a projectile. The goblin struck one of the soldiers and sent him crashing down to the other side. The rest of the soldiers stared in stunned disbelief. More goblins were thrown over in the same way, landing inside the walls and bypassing Gams and the defenders entirely. As the goblins hit the ground and began attacking, a soldier cried out the alarm that the enemy had breached the interior. The sounds of groaning and chaos began to rise from beyond the wall. Back at Carol's house, shouts of warning and panic could be heard from outside. Carol's parents pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close between them and praying quietly that the gods would at least spare their child. Then there was a loud and urgent pounding at the door. It burst open, but it was Gams, with Kim close behind him, asking if everyone inside was all right. Rod Eyes confirmed they were holding on. Lyra asked Gams and Kim whether they themselves were unharmed. Gams noticed the concern directed at the blood staining his armor and quickly explained that it was all goblin blood, not his own. Kim explained that hers had come from the people she had healed on her way over. Rod Ice asked what was happening outside. Gams gave it to them plainly. The battle was not going well, and calling it a battle was not even the right word for it. It was a slaughter. The gate had been torn open, and the entire village was being flooded with monsters. Some soldiers were still fighting, but most were already dead. He admitted with difficulty that he had fled his post, because he had to get his sister and this family out alive. There was no hope left for the village. The only option was to run. Rod Ice looked worn and exhausted by the news. Lyra closed her eyes for a moment. Then Rod Ice straightened and said firmly that running was exactly what they would do. The wagon was already loaded and ready, and they should not waste another second. The group moved quickly out of the house with Gams guarding their path as they went. The women climbed onto the wagon, and Rod Ice announced they were ready to move. But then a goblin appeared directly in their path. Rod Ice cursed under his breath. Gams told him to prepare to drive and promised it would only take a moment. He sprinted toward the goblin and swung his weapon hard. The goblin lunged back at him, and Gams dodged the blow, then pulled his weapon back and cut the creature down in one clean strike. He looked back at the others and gave the signal to move. He leapt onto the wagon and told Rod Ice to forget the main gate. Their best chance of escape was a breach in the northern section of the wall. Rod Ice immediately directed the horses northward. But what lay before them as they moved through the town stopped Rod Ice cold. His eyes went wide at the scene of total devastation. People were crying out for help as goblins swarmed through the streets. Wolves were tearing into the townspeople. Rod Ice pressed his hand over his mouth. They had no choice but to keep moving, passing through the horror with the sounds of desperate cries filling their ears on every side. Gams worked his weapon furiously as they moved, striking down goblins that came near, while Rod Ice kept his eyes fixed on the opening ahead. Tears began to fall down his face. He kicked the horses to go faster. Gams continued cutting down anything that got close and pointed out the breach section of the northern wall when it came into view. Rod Ice drove them through it successfully, and the wagon crossed out of the destroyed town and into the forest beyond. Behind them, the town was already burning. The fire had reached Carol's house and consumed it, but the family had made it into the forest. The wagon pressed on through the trees. The only sound was the rattling and creaking of the wagon as it moved. Kim kept her head bowed in continuous prayer. Carol asked her mother in a small voice whether they were ever going to be able to go home again. Lyra told her gently that home was probably gone, but that she was certain they would find a new one where Carol could have plenty of fun and happiness. Carol asked whether she really meant that. Rod Ice confirmed that Lyra was right. Kim spoke quietly, saying that they were alive, and that surely that meant the gods had been watching over them. The god of fate would continue to guide their path forward. Back in the real world, the doorbell rang. Yoshio came to the door, and the deliver man announced it was a special delivery, asking him to stamp or sign for it. Yoshio said he would get a pen. He looked at the package. On it was printed, "The Village of Fate." A sharp voice cut through the air with a correction. The technique was all wrong and would barely scratch a monster. It was Gams, watching over Rod Ice as he practiced jabbing with his spear. Rod Ice acknowledged the criticism and tried again. He was clearly struggling with it. Gams observed him carefully and told him plainly that he did not think Rod Ice was built for frontline combat. He suggested that Rod Ice would be of greater use to everyone by staying inside and helping from there when the day of corruption arrived, letting Gams and Muris handle the fighting at the front. Rod Ice admitted that he had overestimated himself and thought Gams could use every pair of hands available. He apologized for wasting Gams' time with training that had gone nowhere. Gams told him not to worry about it. Yoshio watched from behind a screen and thought to himself that Gams could be quite hard on people, though not without reason. Back in the cave, the group had shared a meal together. Rod Ice looked worn and tired. Lyra mentioned to Gams that their fruit supply had run out and asked if he could bring some back the next time he patrolled nearby. Gams said he would. Carol immediately lit up and asked if she could come along, wanting to help. Rod Ice reacted with alarm. Carol pointed out that she had not been outside at all since they had arrived at the cave and was tired of being cooped up inside. Rod Ice reminded her of what he had already told her. The closer they got to the end of the month, the more dangerous and unpredictable the monsters became. Going outside was even riskier than usual right now. Carol pushed back, arguing that she would be perfectly safe as long as Gams was with her. Rod Ice tried to reason with her patiently. But Carol had already decided in her mind that she was going to bring back heaps of delicious fruit and was bouncing with excitement about it. Rod Ice's patience ran out. He slammed his fist on the table and told her firmly that she was staying inside, and that was the end of the discussion. The room went quiet. Lyra, Gams, and Kim all fell silent. Muris simply continued eating without reacting. Carol stared at her father, visibly shaken. Her eyes filled with tears. Lyra moved to calm the situation, gently calling to Carol, but Carol turned and ran to her room, crying out that she hated her father. Rod Ice called after her, but she did not stop. He and Lyra followed to check on her. Rod Eyes pressed his hand to his forehead in exhausted frustration. Yoshio watched all of it and felt genuinely sorry for Rod Eyes. The man was carrying an enormous amount of pressure with nowhere to put it. There was not much Yoshio could do from his end except send encouraging words through his prophecies. He could not swoop in and fix the problem directly. He looked at his fate point total, which had grown reasonably well thanks to the villagers' regular offerings. One option that caught his eye was the miracle to spawn traveling hunters, which would run for 3 days. More fighters would mean more firepower in the event of a monster attack. But there was risk involved. Hunters who turn out to be rough or even violent could make the situation worse rather than better. In a normal game, Yoshio would have clicked it without a second thought, but this felt different. What he really wanted, more than anything, was the golem. With a golem under his direct control, he could protect the villagers himself using his gaming instincts and skills. Whatever came at them, he could adapt and respond in real time. The problem was straightforward and brutal. He had only 10 days to accumulate 700 fate points, and he was nowhere near that number. He ran through his options. Asking his parents for money crossed his mind, but he immediately imagined the conversation in his head, begging his family to fund a video game, and dismissed it as a guaranteed way to get himself kicked out of the house. Asking Sayuki was equally out of the question. He thought about trying to sell the gifts the villagers had been sending him, but he had no idea where to find buyers for produce and lumber from someone they did not know, and 10 days was far too little time to sell anything and have the money ready. He slumped in front of his screen and stared at the wall. Then a different thought surfaced. He turned in his chair and opened a search on his laptop, typing in a search for short-term work in the area. He convinced himself it was the obvious answer that most sensible people would have arrived at long before now. The truth was that he had never worked a single day in his life. He had applied for part-time jobs during college, but nerves had made him unable to speak properly in any of the interviews, and everyone had ended in failure before it had even really begun. Looking back now, though, he could see that nerves had not been the only problem. Pride had gotten in the way, too. If a job did not offer impressive enough pay or meet some standard he had set in his head, he had not even considered it. If he had let go of that pride back then, things might have turned out very differently. When it came to finding a proper career, he had only ever applied to companies that recruited from top-tier universities. The results had been exactly what anyone might have predicted. His father had tried to help him, calling in favors to arrange additional interviews, but none of it had come to anything. Yoshio now recognized that it had been as good as throwing his father's generosity back in his face. He had collected every rejection letter he received and used each one as another reason to stop trying, telling himself he was doing everything he could. That had been a decade ago. If he had simply accepted part-time work at any point during those years, he would have built up some experience and kept moving forward. But instead, fear had taken hold and never let go. He knew it was embarrassing at his age. He had not taken things seriously when he had the chance, and now the thought of trying and still being turned down was almost unbearable. He could not keep living this way, keep letting people and himself down like this. He clicked on a job listing. He could hardly believe it had taken a video game to bring him to this point. Most people would think he had lost his mind if they knew the reason. But if he did not get up and do something right now, he probably never would. This would simply be his entire life, unchanged forever. He told himself quietly but firmly to keep his eyes on what mattered. He reminded himself to focus on helping the villagers first. He hoped there was something in the area that would bring in what he needed and wrap up before the end of the month. He thought through the options available to him. Convenience stores paid reasonably well in the short term, but even those positions tended to require a commitment of several months, and they were not ideal for someone who could barely hold a conversation with a stranger. Day labor was sometimes hired on the spot, but he was not sure his body was ready for that kind of physical demand after years of very little activity. Short-term work in his immediate area was difficult enough to find regardless. Without a car or motorbike license, his options were significantly narrowed, and the years of doing essentially nothing had taken a real toll on him in ways he was only beginning to feel properly. Back in the game, Rod Eyes had come out to where Carol was quietly sweeping the floor. He tried to speak to her, but she turned away without a word. Lyra told him gently to give Carol some space and let her work through her feelings for now. Yoshio stared at the screen for a moment, then clenched his fist. He pushed himself up from the chair. He told the villagers in his head to hold on, that he was going to get them through this. He reminded himself that there were more ways to find work than sitting in front of a screen. He would go and pick up one of those free local want-ad magazines from somewhere nearby. No thinking too hard about it. No spiraling into worry. Just go. That was the thought in his head as he got on his bike and rode off. When Yoshio arrived home, he announced that he was back. His mother asked if he had been out, and as she looked at him, her eyes landed on something he was carrying, a local want-ad magazine with job listings visible on the cover. She smiled at him and asked if he had had a nice trip, leaving it at that without making a bigger deal of it. Yoshio was a little caught off guard by how calm she was about it. He went to his room, sat down at his computer, looked through the advertisement, and began filling out a resume form. A little while later, his mother called him for dinner. He came out of his room and made his way to the table. His mother was already there with a smile. He noticed Sayuki was home as well and asked if she was back already. Sayuki asked with a slight edge in her voice whether that was a problem. Yoshio said it was not and welcomed her home, asking if work had been all right. Sayuki said yes, it had been fine. They sat down and began eating. Sayuki noticed that their mother had put particular effort into dinner that evening and asked whether they were celebrating something. Their mother said she was glad Sayuki had noticed, and then shared that Yoshio had decided to look for work. Yoshio choked slightly on his food. Sayuki remarked that he was finally ready to rejoin the world. Yoshio clarified that he was looking at short-term jobs for now, saying he just needed a small amount of money. Their father spoke up and said that whatever the reason, the fact that Yoshio was motivated was what mattered. Yoshio looked over at his father with surprise. He had expected his father to push back or express disappointment that he was not aiming for something full-time, but his father was being completely calm and supportive about it. Sayuki observed that Yoshio had seemed different lately and asked in a teasing way whether he had gotten a girlfriend. Their mother dismissed the idea with a laugh, which left Yoshio wishing she had at least let him be the one to deny it. He also noticed, in the middle of it all, that Sayuki had used a casual and familiar version of his name, something she had not done in a long time. Their father then asked whether any of this had something to do with the village that had been sending Yoshio all those gifts. Yoshio confirmed it, explaining that the people of the village were the ones he wanted to help, and that he did not feel right about only receiving things from them without finding a way to give something back in return. He reminded himself quietly that this was not technically a lie. Sayuki asked what village everyone was talking about, feeling left out of the conversation. Their mother gently suggested they not get into it during dinner and promised to fill her in afterward. Later that night, Yoshio was sitting outside when his father came and joined him. His father asked whether he had found any leads on work. Yoshio said he had 3 solid possibilities and planned to call about them the next morning. His father asked whether it was strictly short-term work he was after. Yoshio confirmed it, explaining that he genuinely wanted to help the village by the end of the month and would have started working that very night if he could. His father muttered quietly about how different that sounded from the Yoshio whose motto had always been to put things off until tomorrow. Yoshio felt something stir in his chest at those words. He was just as surprised by himself as his father was. His father asked whether there were any specific requirements or preferences for the work. Yoshio said he would take what he could get, but that dealing with customers directly was probably not something he could handle well. He thought manual labor might suit him better. Not because it was easy, he clarified, but because it was the kind of work he could picture himself actually doing. His father said he understood, and told Yoshio that if he was serious about it, he could make a phone call on his behalf. Yoshio was caught off guard. He felt both gratitude and the old familiar fear of letting his father down again beginning to rise in him. Before he could let that fear take hold, his father cut through it. He told Yoshio that no matter how old he got, he was still his son, and there was no shame in a child turning to his father for help. It did not make him weak or overly dependent. Using the resources available to him, including family, was simply part of being an adult. Something clicked inside Yoshio when he heard that. He looked at his father and suddenly saw a reflection of Raw Dice in him. The way Raw Dice stood quietly nearby whenever Carol tried to do everything herself, hoping she would turn to him and ask. Had his father been waiting all this time, hoping Yoshio would do the same? Was that what he had always wanted, for his son to simply ask for help? The thought settled over him with unexpected weight. Yoshio lowered himself to his knees before his father and asked for his help. His father's eyes went wide. He quickly opened his phone and made the call. Yoshio sat and listened, his heart hammering in his chest. He told himself there was no backing out now. He had not even properly committed yet, and already his hands were trembling. His father finished the call and asked Yoshio whether he had anything suitable to wear for physical work. Yoshio said he had a tracksuit. His father told him to get changed and be back downstairs within half an hour. Yoshio pointed out that he did not have a resume ready. His father told him not to worry about it. The person he called knew him, and Yoshio could bring a resume along later. Yoshio went upstairs and got ready. He shaved and washed his face, then stood in front of the mirror in his tracksuit. He looked at his own reflection and told himself that this was it. He was going to work. His only real hope was that he would not let his father down again. He told himself firmly there would be no more wavering or hesitating. He had not come this far to turn back now. Then the familiar sound of the game drew his attention. He sat down in front of the screen for a moment. On it, Raw Dice was sitting with his head down, muttering to himself about what was wrong with him. He stood up, called for Lyra, and told her he had nothing pressing to do and wanted to be put to work. Lyra thought about it and told him that Carol had already taken care of most of the day's chores. Raw Dice was visibly surprised. Lyra explained that ever since they had arrived at the cave, Carol had been quietly stepping up and doing what she could to help everyone around her. She could not do a great deal, but she was genuinely trying her best to contribute. Raw Dice stared, taken aback. Lyra murmured softly that children grew up so fast. But when she looked up, Raw Dice was already gone. He had gone straight to Carol, who was outside feeding the horse. Raw Dice apologized to her for how he had behaved that morning. But Carol stopped him and said no. She was the one who should be sorry. She told her father that everyone had always told her he was only trying to keep her safe because she meant more to him than anything in the world. She promised she would not ask to go outside to play anymore. Raw Dice gently held her face in his hands and told her no. He had been the one who was wrong this time. He had been so consumed by worry about the day of corruption that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. This place was their new home now. These people were their neighbors. They had chosen to build their lives here, and they could not spend forever hiding away inside. They had to go out and live. This was Carol's village too, and she was an important part of it. She should be free to do as she liked. He told her he trusted her completely. Carol responded with pure joy. The others who had witnessed the exchange were clearly moved and happy. Yoshio watched the whole thing from his screen and was suddenly on his feet. He slapped both hands against his face to snap himself into focus. The phone on the other side of the house began to ring. It was time. Yoshio smiled at the screen and silently thanked Raw Dice, telling him that was exactly the encouragement he had needed. He told the villagers to take care of themselves, that he would be back soon. He grabbed his things and went out, the door closing firmly behind him. The last image on his monitor as he left was Raw Dice lifting Carol up into his arms while the people around them looked on with warm smiles.